Right. Hi, everyone. We're back with another episode of this Digital Pedagogy Lab Vidcast. And I did like the wave. This is Robin DeRosa. And just to remind you, I'm Clarissa Sorensen-Unruh if you can't read the screen. I'm your teacher for this whole thing. Robin, introduce yourself.
Hello, I am the director of the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative, which is basically a teaching and learning center at Plymouth State University, a public college in New Hampshire. And I've been working on OER, Open Ed, Open Pedagogy in particular for maybe about 5 years. And mostly what I'm interested in is how open can be linked to public architectures for education. I'm a real advocate for starting a truly public higher ed for especially the US. So that's what I work on.
Nice. Wow, you already kind of answered the first question. Way to go, Robin, which is, what is open pedagogy and why do we need it?
I mean, definitely the more I work in open, the less I know the answer to that question, because I think it's, you can start with very simple concepts. For example, an open license allows users to not just absorb knowledge, but to revise or extend knowledge. Mm-hmm. And when you think about students as, users of materials, if they have that relationship with their learning materials, that's a way of making students into contributors. Mm-hmm. So I think originally I sort of had that idea that it's about moving students into that contributor model and thinking about how OER can help us do that. I think the more I worked with students that way, though, mm-hmm. the more I got excited about why you want students to be contributors. Mm-hmm. It's not just because their learning outcomes might be improved, if you do active learning, you'll absorb it better. Right. I think it's more that that's a different way of thinking about how we build our world and how we build knowledge. And it's a sort of anti-elite way of thinking about expertise. Mm-hmm. So I started getting interested in whether there is such a thing as a kind of pedagogy that really ultimately creates knowledge by and for a public, as opposed to for a public by an elite. Mm-hmm. So it seemed like there were some real radical possibilities in there, and that's, I think, what I've gotten most interested in. So I work maybe a little less with OER mm-hmm. than I did at the beginning, although I still pretty much don't ever ask my students to pay money for resources because mm-hmm. of equity. So I use OER a lot, but my focus is, I think, tries to be a little larger now on mm-hmm. what education is for. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, but I'm going to jump off script because you got prompted it. That's the way it goes with us. So how does critical digital pedagogy and open pedagogy overlap then?
Well, you ask an interesting question, and I'm sure there's dissertations to be written on this, but luckily I'm too old and I won't be writing them. One dissertation was enough, because I guess honestly, Rissa, and maybe I won't agree with myself when I watch this video, but I have become much less interested in all of the words you just said.
Okay, yeah, great.
Because I guess. So I use open a lot at my campus. We right. are called the Open Collab, right? Where I work. And I use that as a way of helping to bring some coherence to a constantly dynamic and changing set of ideas about right. what pedagogy is for. And it helps, when you're using language right. to try to focus around things. Right. But I think honestly, there are a lot of different pedagogical approaches that are valuable. Mm. And I think the main thing that's important, at least when I work with faculty, is really less about what are the shades of difference. Because the problem is when you start talking about the shades of difference, you're really reifying or stabilizing these things into a thing.
Right.
But I'm not interested in a thing. I'm interested in like, how do we work?
Right.
And how we work is moving all the time. So I think I'm just, every day asking what ideas are here now. How has somebody revised or changed something? I certainly came to Open through critical digital pedagogy. The first, I was at a Open Ed conference, but the panel that changed my life had nothing to do, as far as I could tell, with like OER or anything related to classical open things.
Right.
It was Jesse and I forget who. It wasn't Sean, I don't think, but they gave their now famous talk called If Frere Made a MOOC. And it was really just about what's powering the architect, what larger ideas about education are powering how you've set up your classes. And I literally went, I don't know. I just think about my content. I don't think about that. So I think what's important is just realizing that, how we teach is a very loaded, that's political and loaded terrain. And at our peril, do we not examine that? So I'm not so into the categorizations, except to say I'm very concerned these days that we are going to lose the ability to not have corporate interest at the center of learning. So anything that asks questions, like critical digital pedagogy asks a lot of questions about ed tech and how it powers learning. Open asks a lot of questions about who gets to make knowledge and who's excluded. These are all the conversations that matter to me right now.
Okay. You're more interested in the questions than the answers. I like that about you.
Yeah.
That's Robin to a T right there.
Yeah.
Okay. So if the way you're thinking about these questions is dynamic, that it's a dynamic, maybe not even a spectrum, but just a dynamic, moving, changing lobby thing, whatever we're going to talk about there. What does the practice of using these pedagogies look like in action?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, a couple years ago, everything I did was in the classroom. I was like primarily a teacher, a professor. Now my students are primarily faculty. I do faculty development. I don't know if there's that much difference in those two worlds.
No matter what.
Yeah, right. But I think, particularly in the classes I ran, I think were very emergent, and I tried to involve students, again, not just in the content, but in the very architecture of the class. So there were lots of time spent on how are we going to learn? What policies do you need to learn? Who gets to make the decisions about exactly which pieces of this we're going to cover? How will you know that you've learned something in the class versus how will I know that you learned something? So it looked a lot like me asking my students to think about those things, most of which they've never been asked to think about, at least not much. So what I ended up with were syllabi that were co-created with students, textbooks that were co-created with students, projects that students created that were connected to their futures, not just my course, but they had found ways of, so it's hard for me to imagine teaching other ways now. And I know you as a STEM person have heard lots of people say like, oh, all this stuff is so great for you, English teachers, but I teach chemistry. It has actual content. But my students are interdisciplinary, so they major in everything from like marketing and business to pre-med to philosophy kinds of things. And I just find that kind of approach has, like, I don't know that I could go back and teach any other way now. And
Mm-hmm.
so the thing I got most interested in though was like, okay, if you're going to teach that way in your class, which you can kind of just do, you can learn it and you can go to DPL, take a
Mm-hmm.
class with Rissa, learn it and do it. But then the question becomes, what do you want next? And
Right.
the question I was interested in is like, what would an institution look like if it really took this approach seriously, if like it didn't just get in the way all the time, right? We talk about ungrading, but at the end you're going to have to assign the grade because the institution, screws it all up.
Right.
So that's what I work on now, is like thinking about institutional design and structural design, and what kinds of things you might need to support the cool pedagogies that lots of us are trying out.
That's awesome. Yeah, I get a lot of that in STEM.
Right.
But I mean, you could, for that argument, I always say something to the effect of, well, you can break STEM into all kinds of things. My wife was just telling me the other day that she has a math education friend who thinks about math as the ability to make logical arguments and to support them robustly. And that that it's really a logic game.
That's actually what English is, but we just want to make illogical arguments and support them robustly. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. All right.
But actually, this was a big part of working with my interdisciplinary students too, was just saying, do you even care to understand what your discipline is? Like, how does your discipline see the world? In order for your students to become a practitioner or an expert in your discipline, they don't just need to know the content, they need to understand, what does the lens of math look like?
Right.
And I just think you can only get there if you let them in a little bit on how you're setting up the learning. So I think it's important, regardless of how much content you might authentically need to plow through, you still need to have those conversations about, what's the context for this learning.
Okay, so I have a question for you, just because I've been dying to ask it of you for a long time, which is, what are your thoughts on this term rigor?
Oh my God, it's so weird that you just asked me that, because I just came out of a meeting where I said, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have a thing on rigor. So our next collab event in the fall, once we get through this, dealing with the fall COVID stuff that we have to do as faculty developers, we're going to host
spring too, just FYI.
Oh yeah, exactly.
It's going to be like the next 2 years. It'll be fine.
Thank you for saying that. But we're going to do a thing on rigor, so stay tuned, and we'll try to open that up, because I actually just had a faculty member from my college say, hey, I've really gotten interested in non-disposable assignments. Like, you really got me fired up about non-disposable assignments. But she teaches in business, and she's very famous for having her students tell her in her evaluations that she's very hard, and she loves that. But they don't say that as much when she does these very engaged kinds of non-disposable projects, not because they're not hard, but because they're classifying rigor with a certain rubric, right?
Right.
And so I said, well, we've got to talk about this. We're going to have a thing. So I think rigor is a very, it's a red herring that gets thrown about very casually to describe certain kinds of things, but we don't rigorously interrogate that term to say, when you say that, what do you mean?
Right.
How much has to be unpleasant? How much has to be related to mastery rather than inquiry? How much has to be? So I don't even know if there's anything wrong with rigor, except, we at least need to talk about what we mean when we say it. And then certainly I think, just like most things in education, it's probably deployed in ways where it's inequitably deployed. So it's deployed in ways that people who are disenfranchised, because of standards of rigor, are probably the same kinds of communities that are actually underserved by education. So this is, very vicious cycle. But I think that that's something that the collab, especially Martha Burtis, I have sort of tasked her with helping us to put that together, because I think lots of people are talking about it smartly, but I'd really like to extend it past our DPL-ish kind of communities and say, let's bring like just a larger general faculty body together. I had a guy at my institution one time get up, and we were thinking about moving from a 3-credit course model to a 4-credit course model. And he said, we shouldn't do that because that's one less credit in a course, which will decrease the rigor of the course. And I was just like, well, if anything, just explain how stupid this all is. That would have to be it right there. But
awesome.
rigor has a lot of the same components, I think, of things like seat time and these metrics that are left over that are not associated with things that we would really stand behind if we teased them out a little bit, you know?
Yeah. No, that's really, that's interesting, because we batted around a lot in science, and I think it's an imaginary term.
Yeah.
I usually want to be like in the Princess Bride moment of like, you keep using that term. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Right. Exactly. I mean, I think a lot of times it means miserable. Like, I mean,
like learning needs to be painful.
I mean,
figure it out. I'm like,
yeah. And then also it goes right to grading too. Like you professor are a failure if all of your students get A's. And I'm like, aren't you a failure if they don't? Like, I don't understand how this works. So many things are off in the conversation, but that's why rigor is a great thing to talk about, because you're ultimately going to talk about grading, right? You're going to talk about a whole bunch of assumptions that we make about what's required for our students to learn.
Right. No, I think I really wanted to hear you say that. I was like, let's get Robin on that one. The last thing that I was going to ask you, and I have lots of questions to ask you, but I'm going to go with the last question, and then we can talk more. Okay. So the last question is, how do we break these pedagogies in the classroom? How do we make our class inequitable? How do we make our class unthoughtful or unreflective or unopen?
What's funny is that, I mean, I was one of the people in the front of the how do we break open education thing.
Yeah.
But I feel differently now that so many things since we started that are so broken that I don't
break
like,
anything.
I don't want to hear the words broken or disrupt or anything anymore.
Okay.
But I do understand the point of the question. And I guess just speaking from the context of Black Lives Matters and COVID, I guess what I would say is the reason breaking feels painful now is I think our public health is broken, right? And it's a tragedy to watch who's paying the price for that. And I think the only solution is got to be something related to human connection.
Right.
So I think a lot of the incentives for us to break open were really about some of the things that Black Lives Matters has done so well, right? They don't want the narrative to be simple. They want people to recognize the pain that's being covered up all the time. And I think that pain is on display for our country to see right now. And we need to take it seriously. We need to honor it, and we need to start thinking about teaching and learning as intimately connected to Black Lives Matters, to COVID. Like, we can't just go on teaching chemistry as if this stuff is not on fire. So I'm just thinking about not so much putting it back together so it looks good again, but honoring the fact that people did a lot of painful work. They paid with their lives to break this shit open. And you know what? It's broken now. Yeah. So how are we going to put it together in a way that doesn't make it what it was before, which was so bad.
Who
So
was it who said, "Don't let a good crisis go without"?
yeah, don't waste it.
Don't waste a
Yeah.
good crisis. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. And, people who've been living like in precarity and with violence for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
we're not woken up by COVID,
Mm-mm.
but a lot of other people were. And I just
Mm-hmm.
hope that, we can not just weather the crisis, but we can actually rebuild things a little bit differently. I think people who've been working in open for a few years are well positioned. We're
Mm-hmm.
well positioned to listen
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
try to do better.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that. I think the open science piece is really exciting. And I'm like, why don't we do this all the time? Right? Like this,
Yeah.
why did we hide, like put all of our knowledge in little boxes and then hide them from one another? That doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. And I feel like during a public pandemic, like it's a good time for the world to realize that, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so I have one more question because I have you here and you're willing. So I think you posted this, but it was an article about how higher ed is at the same place as like the music industry was in the early 2000s. And that Napster, or the late 90s, early 2000s, and that Napster came and destroyed that model that existed and made something different, so that you didn't have to buy the whole CD. You could buy the songs and you could pick and choose and put together new things. Coming from an interdisciplinary kind of moment, what do you think? The whole point of this article or op-ed or whatever it was that that higher ed is ripe for that kind of change, that higher ed could really benefit from not having to have a set degree that you have to do this thing for, and that you can pick and choose and have some ideas about, and that it could come in different ways, like you could get more certificates in that kind of moment. What do you think about that? What are your
Oh,
thoughts?
maybe I will write another dissertation. Um,
I would love to read it.
because so
Book.
the work that I've done in interdisciplinary studies has in some ways been interested in the stuff you're talking about. I've been really interested in what I've talked about at my own institution as the interoperability of curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So my students build majors out of pieces of lots of things
Mm-hmm.
and put them together in ways that one piece from chemistry can serve as a different puzzle piece for 10 different kinds of majors that use
Right.
chemistry differently. And
Right.
I love that, and I think they've done great. We've done great stuff with that program.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fine line between interesting stuff like that, which is still
Mm-hmm.
very disciplinary. It still requires chemistry majors,
Right.
because
Right.
otherwise you don't have the sort of robust disciplinary expertise that you need to farm out these different pieces to the interdisciplinarians.
Right.
But one of the problems is like it's a fine line between that kind of work and the sort of Uberization of higher ed,
Right.
a kind of bits and bytes kind of badgification.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I worry that, in the rush to innovate with good ideas at the core,
Mm-hmm.
we will end up like, I don't think the music industry is necessarily, what's happened there with the streaming services and whatnot, maybe is more akin to what's happening with inclusive access rather than
Right.
OER,
Right.
where,
Right.
you can't loan your CD to your friend anymore. And they're
Right.
basically figured out all the ways that people would share music and found ways to bind those. And
Right.
lots of the payouts don't go to the artists, they go to the
Right.
platforms.
Right.
So I guess what I'm really less interested in is like the cool new ways we deliver education, which I've been, it's my whole career is like trying to think of cool new ways to deliver education. Done it with a
Right.
really cool, innovative program at my own school. I love it. That program is like my life.
Yeah.
But what I care more about is who is learning for and by.
Mm-hmm.
Learning should be for learners,
Mm-hmm.
by people who work for learners.
Yes.
And the second we start mixing up private interest in what I fundamentally consider to be a public good, I think the innovation is going to be a way of enriching certain markets and not truly educational innovation. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about there is driven by venture capital and driven by industry. And you have to separate that from the stuff that's really driven by learner need, you know, by adult learners, say, who want to learn in different models. And like, I'm all for that stuff, but I don't want it to get subbed out to private companies who look like they're meeting those needs, but really they're just siphoning profits and enriching certain markets.
Yeah. It's kind of like it brings to mind the idea of the people who are using pretty exclusively publisher content for the remote classes right now. I'm like, how is your class different from any other class then? Right? I mean, and
obviously, like when we're in such a vulnerable state as this pandemic, when we're mostly not prepared to just go online in 72 hours, all of these companies who have been waiting, you know, just swoop in and they say, you can have 6 months free. We want to get you through this pandemic. And then you're going to learn how to use our tool and build dependence. And then we will control your curriculum the way the learning management system basically dictates how online learning looks at 95% of institutions. And I just, you know, maybe that's the direction we'll go and should go, but I know right now that most faculty are not critically engaged with that. They're just, you know, again, in that sort of, they're not contributing, they're just receiving, right? The marketing is working and we're just going with it. So I think the first step is asking everybody to think critically about how we learn, what we use to learn, what tools we are choosing, and what's the long game. You know, that's why people say, what should we do to deal with COVID in the fall? My response is nothing. Like, only do things that you want to do after the fall, because if you just deal with crisis management, you're going to look for the simple solution, and those solutions may be the things that are most polluted for our students.
Yeah. So what does the long game look like for you?
I don't know, Lisa. I'm just trying to live until November, basically. I don't know.
If you were to envision higher ed, what would it look like?
I think somewhere in the back of my head, I do have, you know, probably white, liberal, liberationist fantasies. But for now, I think I would like to see more people become fluent in the value of public institutions, which there's almost, once you look at them, you can look at the value on any level, whether you care about longevity and health or money, the economy, like, you know, whatever you care about, all of the data will support the value of publics. But because privates are so powerfully in control of our narratives, most of us aren't fluent in that language. And so to me, I would love to imagine that there is a future where more people understand why it's beneficial for the public to serve itself rather than, you know, outsourcing to private industry for certain core things like healthcare or education. And I think right now that feels like that alone would just be a miracle. And that's what I'm aiming at. So I try to talk about the language of public, the value of public, help faculty design courses that are publicly engaged, understand the relationships between how you design your course and public health during a pandemic, even if you don't teach health. All of these things I think need to be connected, you know, basic needs, childcare, transportation. I'd like to see all of these things as a public web, you know, and have whatever capitalism and business you want, but let's have public services that are authentically public services. And To me, that's a hopeful vision that does not feel impossible yet.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you, Robin, for such an awesome talk. Yay!
Oh, it's good to talk to you. And I hope everybody's enjoying DPL and stay in touch.
Yeah.